Good evening, my friends. Gather close and listen well. Imagine this, the sun beating down so fierce it could melt asphalt. The sand of northern Burkina Faso burning hotter than steel. The sky, pale and merciless, stretches above like a punishment. In the distance, a boy drags a plastic jerry can across cracked earth. He is searching for water, the most precious currency of his country. But there is none. Just heat, dust, and silence. And then the order came, not to distribute water, not to save the thirsty, but to bury it, millions of gallons, purified, treated, then injected deep beneath the dunes, hidden, vanished. To the outside world, it looked insane. To the thirsty, it looked cruel. But to President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, it was something else entirely. It was war, because in this landlocked nation, rain is not seasonal. It is political. Less than 600 millimeters a year. No ocean, no glaciers, no mercy from the sky. Every well becomes a front line. Villagers fight villagers. Corporations battle farmers. Soldiers clash with despair. One spill can poison a harvest. 1 month without rain can starve a region. So why hide water while the nation bleeds for it? That's what baffled international observers. That's what sparked outrage across Europe and America. But Traoré was not playing by colonial logic. His strategy was different. His vision, shocking. He declared water not a gift, not a commodity, but sovereignty itself. And if sovereignty meant burying water beneath layers of sand and steel, then so be it. Still, one haunting question hangs over the Sahel tonight. When salvation lies buried beneath your feet, what happens when the desperate realize it's there? The year was 2025, and the directive came stamped in red, 44B classified. Its title was as stark as its mission, the Sovereign Water Doctrine. It wasn't written in ink. It was written in brine. President Ibrahim Traoré ordered the desalinated water, purified through reverse osmosis, would not flow into public taps, nor be poured into open-air reservoirs. Instead, it would be buried. Not oil, not gold, not uranium, but water injected into underground chambers, sealed with layers of hydrophobic membranes, reinforced with geomembrane shielding, wrapped in sand, and hidden where satellites could not see. Beneath the dunes of the Sahel, beneath the cracked clay that mocked thirsty children, lay secret vaults of liquid sovereignty. The West shook its head. Wasteful, said Brussels. Reckless, muttered Washington. Paranoid, scoffed Paris. But Traoré was unmoved. His government explained the science clearly. Burkina Faso loses billions of liters each year to open-air evaporation. Conventional dams vanish into thin air before the people can drink. To store water above ground in 120-degree heat is to surrender it. To bury it is to protect it. But this wasn't just science. It was politics. The reservoirs were built not by the IMF, not by the UN, not by French contractors, but by Burkinab engineers youth under 30, trained in Accra, Addis Ababa, and Ouagadougou itself. Traoré refused outside financing. He refused the donor logos, the consultant convoys, the endless cycle of dependency. His logic was brutal. If you take their money for water, then the water is never truly yours. So he buried it, quietly, defiantly. Project Silent Reservoir was born. Thousands of barrels of desalinated brine sunk into engineered bunkers, powered by solar microgrids, monitored by AI, invisible to drones, unreachable by thieves or saboteurs. Each reservoir a hidden arsenal, a weapon against drought, a secret lifeline for a future day. Critics screamed that it was madness. Why hide water when villages starved? Why conceal survival itself? Yet Traoré saw further than the donors and diplomats. He saw the arithmetic of survival. Rainfall was collapsing. Drought was accelerating. Burkina Faso, one of the most climate-vulnerable nations on Earth, could not afford to play by rules written in Brussels boardrooms. He called it preparation. Others called it cruelty. But beneath that controversy lay a doctrine far sharper than charity. He declared openly, Water is not aid. Water is sovereignty. And sovereignty must be defended like gold, like uranium, like life itself. The symbolism was staggering. Just as France guarded its nuclear fuel, just as Saudi Arabia managed its oil beneath the Rub al-Khali desert, Burkina Faso would guard its water, not for export, not for investors, not for speculation, but for Burkinab children, unborn yet already thirsty. And so the pumps hissed, the valves sealed, and gallons vanished beneath the dunes. Ordinary citizens never saw them. Villagers trudged for hours, digging through clay, desperate for a muddy sip. Mothers boiled roof runoff in cracked pots. Children carried cans 20 kilometers to find a trickle. Meanwhile, beneath their feet, buried beneath treated sand, lay hidden oceans. The moral shock was unbearable. The poorest of the poor walking past salvation they could not touch. A lifeline locked beneath the ground, guarded not by soldiers but by silence. To some, it looked like betrayal. To Traoré, it looked like survival. And here lies the haunting paradox. In a nation choking on thirst, the leader ordered water buried not to hide it, but to preserve it. He called it insurance against tomorrow's droughts, tomorrow's famines, tomorrow's exodus. But the people asked only one thing: what about today? And that is where the true fracture begins. Because in the Sahel, the crisis is not abstract. It is lived in every coughing faucet, every cracked riverbed, every collapsed animal carcass. And when the desperate realize salvation lies just beneath their feet, can the silence truly hold? 699 words. Do you want me to continue with Task 3? The climax and reactions. In Ouagadougou, the capital, the announcement hit like thunder. Rumors had already spread, whispers of trucks moving at night, barrels sealed and sunk beneath the sand, foreign satellites confused by shifting signatures in the desert. But when President Ibrahim Traoré finally stood before his ministers and declared the water doctrine a matter of national security, the room froze. Water, he said, is not charity. Water is not aid. Water is sovereignty, and sovereignty is not negotiated. For his cabinet, some young, some still tied to the old donor system, the statement was a shock. For the farmers, the herders, the mothers boiling dirty rainwater, it sounded like betrayal. They wanted water in their hands, not sealed beneath the soil. Crowds gathered outside government offices, demanding to know why their children carried jerry cans for miles, while millions of gallons slept under dunes. To them, the policy looked like cruelty disguised as strategy. But Traoré was unflinching. He had seen the math. The country had recorded less than 740 millimeters of rain, its lowest in a decade. Some provinces had fallen below 500 millimeters, far below survival thresholds. Crops withered, pastures turned to ash, cattle collapsed on riverbeds. The capital's treatment plants ran 30% below demand, and black markets thrived on stolen gallons. If Burkina Faso kept depending on rain, it would die not in one day, but in waves. First crops, then livestock, then people, then hope. He called it openly the silent genocide of climate neglect. Behind closed doors, his officials used a harsher term: hydro-exodus, the mass displacement of millions, not by bombs or bullets, but by dust. International observers were stunned. Brussels dismissed the doctrine as reckless. Geneva called it dangerous. Washington labeled it destabilizing. The IMF asked why a poor nation would bury what it most desperately needed. French newspapers mocked Traoré as delusional, a leader playing pharaoh while his people starved. Aid organizations demanded access, transparency, oversight. Yet through it all, Traoré never flinched. To him, this was not madness. This was defense. Just as nations protect oil in vaults and uranium in silos, Burkina Faso would protect water, the resource of the future, the currency of survival. The world saw risk. He saw preparation. The reaction on the streets, however, was different. In Kaya, mothers marched with empty cans tied to sticks, chanting for release of the buried reserves. In Fada and Gourma, clashes broke out at municipal wells. where desperate families accused soldiers of diverting water to hidden tanks. Some called Traoré a prophet, saving their children's future. Others cursed him as a tyrant, hoarding what should flow freely. And still, the desert crept closer. Day after day, wells coughed dust. Children fainted in classrooms from dehydration. Farmers lost entire harvests to a single week of sun. What the people saw was not doctrine. What they felt was thirst. But beyond the borders, something stranger began to unfold. African leaders watched quietly. Some envied his defiance. Others feared it. If Traoré succeeded, it would mean Africa no longer needed to beg for dams, consultants, or aid convoys. If he failed, it would mean chaos. A thirsty population tearing open the ground in rebellion. Global corporations also took notice. Water firms in Europe, hedge funds in New York, private contractors in Dubai all had bet heavily on Africa's water future. They imagined owning the pumps, selling the rights, bottling the survival of entire nations. But Burkina Faso was writing a new playbook. No foreign consultants, no multinational contracts, no logos on the pipelines. Water as sovereignty, sealed underground, immune to speculation. It was more than policy. It was defiance, a rejection of the old script where Africa waits, suffers, receives. Traoré was rewriting the narrative in real time. He was telling the world, we will not beg. We will not rent survival. We will bury it, guard it, and claim it as our own. And yet, in the shadow of this defiance, fear simmered, because in every village, people asked the same forbidden question. What happens when the thirsty realize that salvation lies just beneath their feet? Would they dig? Would they riot? Would the state itself fracture under the weight of desperation? Or would they endure, believing in a future they could not see, trusting a leader who buried water like treasure? The climax was not the burial itself. It was the silence that followed, a silence louder than any gunfire, heavier than any drought. The silence of a nation staring at its cracked earth, knowing that beneath the sand flowed salvation, locked away by its own president. And in that silence, one truth lingered. Sometimes survival feels like betrayal, and sometimes betrayal is the only path to survival. When the pumps sealed and the reservoirs went silent, the consequences did not wait. They arrived swiftly, like heat waves rolling across the Sahel. Inside Burkina Faso, the doctrine of buried water split the nation in two. In Ouagadougou, the capital, political debate turned to open confrontation. Traoré's inner circle praised the move as visionary. We are no longer beggars, one minister declared. We are guardians. Yet opposition voices accused him of engineering scarcity to consolidate power. You cannot govern a starving man by telling him his grandchildren will feast. One former parliamentarian shouted. Civil society groups began to fracture. Some activists marched in support of sovereignty, waving signs that read, "Water is our flag." Others marched against the president, chanting, "Open the reservoirs." The battle lines were no longer just in the desert, they were in the streets, in the villages. The fallout was more visceral. In Kaya, mothers traded half their daily rations to secure a single bucket from the black market. In Tapoa, herders shot at each other over access to a single functioning borehole. In the north, children stopped school not because of violence, but because their days were consumed by the search for water. Every empty can became a weapon of accusation. The government has water, villagers said, but we do not. And with every whisper, unrest deepened. Traoré deployed soldiers to protect the silent reservoirs, turning water into a matter of national defense. Rumors spread that secret maps existed, showing the buried reserves. Young men in Dori and Jibo began organizing raids, convinced that if they could just break into the underground tanks, salvation would be theirs. Soldiers responded harshly, reinforcing the perception that water was being guarded like gold, while the people were left to wither. Politically, the doctrine shifted Burkina Faso's alliances, relations with France, already strained after the military expulsion of French troops, collapsed further. Paris accused Ouagadougou of weaponizing humanitarian resources. Brussels threatened to cut aid. the United Nations issued cautious statements warning of mismanagement of vital resources. Yet in Bamako and Niamey, leaders quietly applauded. Mali and Niger, fellow Sahel nations choking on drought, began considering their own underground reserves. For ordinary Burkina, this geopolitics meant little. What mattered was the daily arithmetic of survival. In Ouahigouya, families rationed themselves to one meal a day because cooking water was too precious. In Bobo Dioulasso, cattle markets collapsed as herders sold livestock at half price before they died of thirst. Across the countryside, once thriving farming zones turned to ghost villages. The state called it planned resilience. The people called it abandonment. Still, something deeper was happening. The buried water, though invisible, began to reshape identity. Youth groups in Ouagadougou adopted slogans like, "Water is our weapon." University students debated the doctrine in packed lecture halls, some calling it genius, others calling it suicide. The conversation itself was radical. For the first time, Burkina were not asking how much aid they would receive, but whether their sovereignty was worth their suffering, and the consequences rippled outward. Foreign investors, long circling Burkina Faso's mines and infrastructure, grew cautious. What if water rights became untouchable? What if Traoré's doctrine spread across the Sahel? Already, reports surfaced of corporations lobbying quietly in Geneva, warning that if Africa began hoarding water underground, the global market for water futures would collapse. Meanwhile, aid organizations faced a dilemma. If they delivered water openly, they risked clashing with the state, undermining Traoré's sovereignty doctrine. If they withheld, they risked accusations of letting civilians die. Some chose to bypass the government, delivering discreet shipments to villages. Others pulled out entirely, citing hostile conditions. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso found itself nearly alone, cut off from traditional aid pipelines, yet still far from self-sufficient. The paradox was brutal. On one hand, the policy preserved water for a future that might otherwise not exist. On the other, it accelerated civilian suffering in the present. The president framed this as sacrifice. Critics called it cruelty, but to his supporters, it was the price of independence. And so, Burkina Faso stood at a crossroads, a nation divided, thirsting, yet also defiant. Every dry well became a protest. Every sealed reservoir became a symbol. The people asked, "Are we dying today to live tomorrow?" And no answer, from ministers or soldiers, could satisfy the urgency of a child's empty cup. For now, the silence held, but beneath the silence lay pressure. Building, waiting, and pressure, like water, never stays hidden forever. The road ahead for Burkina Faso is neither straight nor smooth. It is carved in dust, shadowed by drought, yet now threaded with pipes and hidden reservoirs. Traoré has drawn a line between survival and sovereignty. But whether the nation can walk it without collapse remains unknown. His government presses forward with two parallel strategies. The first, grassroots water capture. Hundreds of microdams, retention basins, and hillside catchments have already transformed local agriculture in select provinces. Millet grows where only thorns once stood. Women's cooperatives plant tomatoes in dry season. In some regions, harvests have doubled in a single year. To supporters, this is proof that sovereignty is not a dream. It is working, drop by drop. The second, grand corridors. The treaties with Guinea and Ivory Coast are already reshaping geography. Seawater pipelines, desalination hubs, and buried conduits are building what Traoré calls the invisible river. If successful, it could supply every major population center, from Ouagadougou to Dori. If it fails, it could bankrupt the nation and ignite unrest. But the road ahead is more than engineering. It is political survival. Burkina Faso's stance has alienated traditional donors. France has withdrawn funding. The EU has frozen projects. The UN hovers, cautious but skeptical. That isolation means the country must walk alone, relying on its own engineers, its own youth, its own fragile stability. And yet, beneath the uncertainty lies something powerful. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso is not waiting for aid convoys, not waiting for rain, not waiting for permission. It is building, digging, burying, choosing defiance over dependence. Still, the question looms, can a nation hold its people together when their daily thirst collides with promises of tomorrow? Can sovereignty survive the protests of hungry mothers and desperate farmers? Or will the doctrine of buried water collapse under the weight of its own silence? The road ahead is not guaranteed. But one thing is certain, Burkina Faso has forced the world to confront a truth it preferred to ignore. In the 21st century, the greatest revolutions may not be fought with rifles or oil, but with water, hidden, guarded, and weaponized beneath the sand. From Washington to Brussels, from Geneva to Paris, the world has been forced to reckon with a paradox. The poorest, most landlocked nation in Africa may have just declared the first true water revolution of the century. For the United States, the reaction is conflicted. On one hand, analysts at the Pentagon and the State Department view Ibrahim Traoré's water doctrine as a national security experiment with global implications. Water, they warn, will be the oil of the 21st century. If Burkina Faso proves that sovereignty can be enforced through hidden reservoirs and subterranean rivers, other nations may follow. The U.S. fears a new wave of resource nationalism that could complicate aid, trade, and influence across the Sahel. Yet another camp in Washington whispers something else: respect. Because while American cities wrestle with droughts in California and the Colorado River crisis, a small, battered African nation is demonstrating a level of innovation and political will that wealthy powers often lack. Quietly, some U.S. engineers and climate scientists have begun studying Burkina Faso's model, asking if elements of it could be replicated at home. Europe, meanwhile, seethes. France denounces the doctrine as reckless defiance. Brussels warns of instability. Aid agencies accuse Traoré of weaponizing water. But in Africa, the mood is shifting. From Mali to Niger, leaders and citizens alike are watching closely. If Burkina Faso can defy donors, bury water, and still survive, why can't they? The global view is clear. Traoré has not just buried water, he has unearthed a debate the world wanted to avoid. And the shockwaves are spreading far beyond the Sahel. Because if a landlocked nation with no coast, no great rivers, and no global allies can build its own invisible river, then what excuse do the rest of us have? The sun still burns over the Sahel. The wells still cough dust. The children still drag their empty cans across clay that no longer yields mercy. Yet beneath that parched earth, a quiet revolution hums. Pipes pressurize, valves seal, desalinated oceans flow inland, buried reservoirs wait for the day they must be opened. This is not science fiction. This is Burkina Faso in 2025. President Ibrahim Traoré has taken the unthinkable step, turning water into a weapon of sovereignty. To his critics, he is reckless. To his supporters, prophetic. But to the thirsty, the question is far more brutal. Can a child survive on promises of tomorrow when their lips are cracked today? That is the shock the world refuses to face. The wars of the future may not be fought for oil or ideology, but for rivers, aquifers, and rain clouds that no longer come. And while wealthy nations argue, a landlocked African state has already acted. It buried its water, not out of madness, but out of defiance. Not to hide hope, but to protect it. So here is the question, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of us. If the poorest nation on earth can build its own invisible river, what excuse remains for America, for Europe, for the world? Will we wait for thirst to crush us, or will we prepare before the storm arrives? If this story shakes you, do not look away. Share it. Comment, save it, because the war for water has already begun, and silence is the most dangerous weapon of all.